Welcome to Research Debrief. I'm Rachel Chonko, Editor-in-Chief of Club Solutions, here with my co-host Luke Carlson, CEO and founder of Discover Strength, for a podcast aimed at bridging the gap between the fitness industry and the latest science in under 20 minutes. Luke, welcome.
Good to be here, Rachel. Good to see you.
Awesome, same. All right, I'd love to hear what research you reviewed this week.
Yeah, so I have one key paper that I want to go through, but I have to touch on an additional paper that was recently published that maybe continues to set the stage for why this conversation is so important. So this paper is published in the journal Physical Education and Sports Studies and Research. That's the name of the journal. And this particular journal article, the title of the paper is A Critical Analysis of the Disconnection between science and practice in weight training. And what this author basically gets into is, hey, we have a tremendous amount of scientific research, but it turns out that none of that research is actually getting to the practitioner. Now, clearly the practitioner in this case was someone that was a little bit more focused on weight training, but of course, we're seeing this more and more in the published literature. So I'm going to share the conclusion from this paper. I think it's a great way to frame up why it's so important for us to have these discussions. They conclude improved scientific communication via targeted educational programs, digital platforms, and collaboration between researchers and policymakers is urgently needed to bridge this gap and maximize resistance training's public health impact. What they're saying is when we look at all this research, it turns out that exercise is really good for us. But when they survey and they do research on exercise practitioners, their knowledge base, they're largely unaware of these benefits. We all know that exercise is good for us, but we can't speak to it specifically, which renders us ineffective in influencing one, our consumer, but two, policymakers. And so I think this gets back to why this conversation is so important for us. And that paper was published recently. Now, the paper that I would really love to dive into today is a really exciting topic: mechanisms of resistance training and its impact on anxiety and depression. And this is a literature review. So a lot of times we see a meta-analysis or a literature review. These papers are a little bit more exciting than a single individual study. You've probably heard people say things like you can find one study that supports about anything, and that's largely true. So rather than looking at one study, what we like to do every few years is publish a meta-analysis or a literature review, which means let's look at all the scientific papers on a particular topic that have been published over the last 3 to 5 years, and let's look at what are the common threads. And if it's a meta-analysis, we pour some statistics over all of it and say, what is the current state of the science? So when we read a meta-analysis, when we read a literature review, we're understanding this is the current state of the science on a particular topic. So we're going to look at the current state of the science on how engaging in some strength training, resistance exercise impacts anxiety and depression. Now, I think this topic is so incredibly important because anxiety, whether it's generalized anxiety and depression and all of the mental health issues, they are on the rise. And we say things in the health club world like people need to exercise because it's a great treatment. It's a great way to mitigate some of these mental health issues. But that's generally all we say. We don't know much beyond that. So this paper says specifically, we know what those benefits actually are. So I want to talk through a few of those benefits. Now, let's be clear. This is a review of all of the literature. So we're looking at all the studies published on this topic. And I'm going to go into a few quotes from the paper. So in the abstract, they say anxiety and depression disorders are among the most prevalent and debilitating mental health conditions, significantly impacting global health and quality of life. As soon as you hear that right there, you think, my goodness, our industry could step up and be an answer to this. Current pharmacological and psychotherapeutic treatments, while effective, face challenges such as limited accessibility, high costs, and stigma. Resistance training seems a promising non-pharmacological intervention for the prevention and management of these disorders. Okay, so I'm going to jump right ahead to what they were really trying to get at. This review evaluates the efficacy of resistance training in preventing and treating anxiety and depression with a focus on its biological and psychological mechanism. So not only does it work, but we're understanding why it works across diverse populations. And then we'll go a little bit deeper, but I just want to end with the conclusion. This is the big headline. Resistance training is an effective intervention to improve mental health outcomes, right? So that is the big conclusion.
That's so powerful what you said, because like you had mentioned, not everyone has access to great mental health treatment. And so it sounds like what you're saying is resistance training can be a more accessible way for the US population to be managing anxiety and depression in particular.
Yeah,
Correct me if I'm
absolutely.
wrong.
Yeah, absolutely. And they walk through why is that? Okay, so let's go through just a couple of them. One of them is, frankly, when we can avoid or mitigate the classic chronic diseases that plague people as we age in this country, we actually have better mental health scores. So one of the things they comment on is resistance exercise. So strength training is a great way to improve cardiovascular health. Now, side note, I think this is an underappreciated benefit of resistance training. We always think about doing aerobic exercise or cardio to mitigate cardiovascular disease risk, but the research is very clear that strength training is more effective for that. And they speak to that.
Wow.
Cardiovascular and metabolic effects are among the most important results of resistance exercise training. Resistance training has some cardiovascular and metabolic benefits. Some studies even show that it can be just as effective or more effective than aerobic endurance training in reducing some major cardiovascular risk factors. It promotes improved capillary density around muscle fibers, enhances nutrient and oxygen delivery, etc. So we see improvement in the ability of us to uptake glucose into our muscle cell, control our insulin, reducing the risk of these metabolic disorders. Okay. Of course, strength training also helps lower our systolic blood pressure, improves our lipid profile. So that's less to do with anxiety and depression. But of course, when someone has cardiovascular disease, anxiety and depression rates and severity increase. So from here, they talk about mood, emotional well-being, and body image. They say resistance training stimulates the release of endorphins, which are known as natural mood elevators. Of course, we're aware of that. Additionally, achieving strength or fitness goals fosters a sense of accomplishment, which can significantly enhance self-esteem and body image. So then they go on and talk about cognitive function. For older adults, resistance training has been associated with slower cognitive decline and improved executive function. Now, that's one of my favorite areas of research. We have so much scientific research, great meta-analysis saying strength training is the best way to restore cognitive function as we age. Stress regulation. Resistance training provides a constructive outlet for stress and frustration, helping individuals manage daily challenges more effectively. It can regulate levels of stress hormones, such as cortisol and adrenaline, leading to a calmer state of mind. This physiological balance contributes to emotional stability. And I'm not going to go through all of them, but they go deep into better sleep, quality of life in elderly individuals, improved self-efficacy in elderly individuals, reduced symptoms of anxiety and depression. Now, this is true in the general population. It's also true with people with a variety of mental health conditions. So one of the things that I'm very acutely aware of among our health clubs, but not just our health clubs, among our primary care physicians, we're pretty good at telling fit people to work out. There's a great paper just published that physicians are not good at telling unfit people to work out. And of course, unfit people really benefit from this. And I say unfit, but I also mean people with a whole variety of mental health conditions. And they're saying this works, this is efficacious for a variety of different populations, chronic disease, mental health ailments of all different kinds. We can see value in engaging in resistance training. Now, one of the things I really want us to focus on here, Rachel, is I think there's a more important why that underpins our visit to the health club. Okay. I don't think health club operators have marketed, have communicated the most important reasons we engage in exercise. Frankly, I speak with exercisers every day. I've yet to meet an exerciser that says, I go to the gym to battle my anxiety or my depression. I've yet to meet a primary care physician that says, my generalized anxiety patients, we always refer them to significant resistance training. And over the decades, we have said things like, yes, going to the gym is my therapy. But I don't think we've connected this empirical research with, no, that's an efficacious approach. That is an efficacious approach. That's what we should be doing is we should be engaging in this case, in this particular review, resistance exercise to treat or mitigate anxiety and depression.
Yeah. So in the past, it's been more of a slogan and it has a foundational base in scientific research.
Yeah, absolutely. And let me give you another one of their big conclusions here. So they conclude resistance training shows significant antidepressive effects, regardless of participants' age, sex, or health. Man, every operator right now can listen to that and say, okay, age, sex, or health. Think of the targeted programs we could create around this. Okay. Moreover, while supervision appears to be crucial, right away when you hear that, you say, okay, how do we create classes around this? How do we use small group training? How do we position our personal training to focus primarily on this? So I'll continue. While supervision appears to be crucial, the specifics of resistance training, such as duration, intensity, frequency, and volume, seem to play a secondary role. That is really interesting. So they're
Wow.
saying the most important thing is that you're supervised, which, by the way, if we work in our industry, we love that, right? You shouldn't probably do it on your own in the basement. You should go to a health club. You should go to a facility and be coached by someone. That is actually more important than are you nailing duration, intensity, frequency, and volume. And I think
Interesting.
we've probably placed too much of an emphasis on duration, intensity, frequency, and volume. But instead, more important, according to the research, is are we doing it with some supervision? Now, this is just a scientific research paper published in a medical journal. If I'm a health club operator and I read this, I think it's almost like it was written for me. It was written for us, saying that being with a professional is what's important. I'll continue in their conclusions. Evidence points to the effectiveness of resistance-based training routines in both reduction of depression symptoms and preventing the onset of clinical depression. Researchers point out that resistance training should be considered in a multimodal treatment in patients suffering from depressive symptoms. To me, that's as good as it gets. We need the
Wow.
supervision, we need the coaching, and it works across all populations.
Wow. Okay. Very interesting. So, how should gyms adapt or rethink what they're doing now based on this research?
Yeah, great question. So I'm going to make the kind of classic early on cliches. We should start positioning the exercise that we provide. In this case, it's resistance training, but in future discussions, we'll talk about every conceivable form of exercise and say the target market, the population that we're trying to serve, what is the weed that they're staring at? And we say weed. When I say that, I mean we're looking at a field of grass and weeds and vegetation, and sometimes it's overwhelming. What the great marketer needs to do is not say we got all these different issues, and in our case, all these different solutions for all these different problems. That's what exercise provides. But instead, what we have to do as an operator is point to one weed. That
Mhm.
one weed is a significant problem. In this case, the weed is anxiety and depression. And of course, it helps if that weed is actually a problem that resonates with so much of your customer base. And I would say that this largely does. And I think that's more true end of 2025, early 2026 than maybe any other time. So we point to that weed and then we build our programming around that. And if you don't want to build programming around that, we can build our messaging around that. I think we've messaged too much classically around things like weight loss and bigger biceps, right? We have very weak research that says exercise helps people lose weight. We have a tremendous amount of research, we just went through it, that strength training helps people mitigate anxiety and depression. So I would market around these benefits, speaking to that one weed, and then I would build programming around it and say, what are we doing in our club from a one-on-one personal training, from a small group or semi-private, okay, from a small group, a classic small group, and from a group exercise perspective that is focused on this. And if it is focused on this, we know it needs to be led by an instructor. And we know that the variables that we've always thought are important are less important than the supervision, the duration, the volume, the intensity. Okay, but we do know, of course, it should be resistance training. I'll just zoom out and say, I don't know too many operators that have said, wow, strength training, what's the primary benefit? Maybe let's position it as reducing anxiety and depression. And that's very much an evidence-based statement.
Yeah. Anecdotally, could this be why the strength training trend has taken on such momentum? Because the consumers are clamoring for it. Maybe they just realized how great it makes them feel and that they do have less anxiety and just feel a lot better from it.
Yeah, for sure. That very much could be the case. My answer is always we don't know because there's so many benefits of exercise and so many benefits of strength training. Why is strength training experiencing this, I wouldn't say resurgence, but this surge in popularity as a whole? Maybe it is connected to that, maybe it's not. I will say it's a pretty significant percentage of the population that are not going to our gyms or our health clubs who are experiencing anxiety and depression, and this could be a wonderful option for them. I think there's an operator out there that could own the marketplace for resistance training as a treatment for anxiety and depression and could build a brand around just that because the reality is I don't think anxiety and depression are going away. And one of my favorite kind of quotes or principles from Jeff Bezos is stop asking me the question, what's coming up around the corner? What's the future of AI? Tell me what the future looks like. That's the wrong question. Jeff Bezos says the right question is, what is not about to change in human beings? And for Bezos, the answer is they're always going to want low prices and they're
Yeah.
always going to want convenience. He said, I can build around that. If we think anxiety and depression is largely going to be a part of our lives going forward, we could build our businesses, our offerings around that. And that's not me rooting for anxiety and depression to stay around, but I think it's going to be a part of our life. It's part of the human condition, and we could build a business around how we could effectively curtail it.
Yeah. There's everyone's $1 million business idea from Luke.
Yeah.
All right, awesome. So I just want to circle back to one thing you were talking about, which was the difference between an individual piece of research and meta-analysis. I think that's important for operators to understand the distinction. So does meta-analysis typically have more credibility? Okay,
100%. That's the whole idea is we want the meta-analytical papers to guide how we're thinking about exercise as a whole, rather than pick one paper that might have different flaws in it, or frankly, might have 10 subjects in it, and that's it. I just read a great paper a week ago with 10 subjects in it. And it was an interesting paper, but there's 10 subjects in it. And so a meta-analysis will say, we looked at 37 published papers. On average, each paper had 85 participants. And here's what we learned. And I just made up those numbers. Sometimes it's 200 people per study, and we're looking at literally 120 studies. Absolutely, when the meta-analysis is published, that really informs how we're thinking about the fitness topic.
perfect. And then I just want to summarize. It seems like the health club industry's been, they understand the benefits, but being able to point to specific research and have it founded in science is really important for credibility.
Yeah, because oftentimes we're wrong or we overstate or understate things, right? Like it turns out that resistance training is really good for mitigating anxiety and depression. Now, forever we've said, hey, broadly, it makes you feel better, endorphins, like we've always said things like that. But now we understand with great certainty how effective it is. While other areas that we'll get into, frankly, working out doesn't work as well as we thought, or the approach to working out doesn't work as well as we thought. And we probably have said, yep, this is good for us. And the reality is, it's actually not very good for us. And so sometimes our assumptions as health club operators are just dead wrong.
Yeah.
And I think we get so much more credibility if we point out, well, we have the strength of the evidence supporting this statement, and we actually don't have that much evidence supporting this statement. And the beauty of all this is there's enough incredible benefits of exercise and being active that we don't need to overstate any of it. We can speak with a little bit more nuance and specificity.
Yeah. But if you are going to make a bold statement, make sure it's founded in research and be
Absolutely.
wary of trends and making sure that there actually is real science. If you're going to be making, again, bold statements, make sure there's real science backing them up versus just going out there and making a bunch of claims that may be disproved in the future.
Absolutely. And I think we have to think about this as we build our brands and we become more reputable in the eyes of the consumer, in the eyes of healthcare practitioners that we, of course, want to refer to us. And we want to be a part of this allied healthcare continuum. And of course, policymakers as well. That's how we have to show up. if we want to increase our credibility there. But we're not the only ones getting that pressure. I read a paper just published where all of these researchers, 48 authors, really putting the pressure on physicians, saying, hey, as a physician, you have to do a better job of prescribing exercise correctly. You can't just tell someone go on a walk, because it turns out your patient needs much more than that. And so our physicians are feeling that same pressure that we're feeling, that whatever comes out of our mouth, it probably should be connected to the scientific research. We can't say exercise, it's good for us, do it. We got to go a step further than that. And I think that's good for our industry.